Era mi maestro.
Tu amigo.
Mi maestro. Amigo.
Modesto dice. Modesto dice.
You're the expert.
No se oye, sí. Sí, se oye. No se oye. No se oye.
Ese sí.
Hola. ¿Sí? Bueno. Tenemos siempre un problema entre el calor y la audición. Si dejamos los aire acondicionados no hay no hace calor, pero no va a oír demasiado, pero dejémoslo del comienzo y me hacen saber si no se oye y ya nos apagamos. ¿Okay? Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo a la sesión en un horario matineo. Ted Piccone, que es nuestro expositor, tiene que tomar su avión relativamente temprano, así que vamos a comenzar bien más al punto que de costumbre. El título de la presentación, Democracias Emergentes y el destino del orden internacional liberal, se asemeja bastante al título de su último libro que acaba de publicar, así que vamos a sacar ventaja de eso para que nos cuente sus tesis principales desarrolladas en el libro. Pero ¿quién es Ted Piccone o Theodore Piccone? Pero más, no para artístico, es Ted Piccone. Es Senior Fellow de la Brookings Institution, es doctor en jurisprudencia de la Universidad de Columbia, Bachelor of Arts de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Está trabajando en estos momentos en el proyecto de la Iniciativa por Latinoamérica del programa de política exterior de la Brookings Institution. Fue vicepresidente y director de ese programa y anteriormente, durante 8 años, asesor sobre América Latina y democracia global en la administración Clinton en el National Security Council, en el Departamento de Estado y en la oficina del secretario de Defensa en el Pentágono. Fue cofundador y director ejecutivo del proyecto Democracy Coalition Project, desde donde se promueve la cooperación internacional por la democracia y los derechos humanos. Y trabajó anteriormente como consejero de la Comisión de la Verdad de las Naciones Unidas en El Salvador. Ha escrito y editado varios libros y artículos sobre política exterior, América Latina y desarrollo humano. Un currículum extenso y valioso, diría yo, por lo cual más que satisfecho de tenerte acá con nosotros y muchas gracias por haberte hecho tiempo en este viaje tan apretado para venir a hablarnos.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, José María, y disculpas por mi castellano no tan bueno, entonces voy a hablar en inglés, es mejor para todos.
Ahí están los aparatos para la traducción, o sea.
Sí, sí hay una traducción, una excelente traductora. Voy a hablar sobre este tema, and I have to say in advance, in light of what happened this week in Paris, it might appear a little too optimistic. I wrote this over a number of years, and I tried to identify. Can you hear me? Okay. No? Closer. Louder. Okay. How's that? I wrote this over a number of years at a point in time when I think there were certain trends evident. Now there's some question marks, but we can talk about that in the question and answer. So the topic is the role that these 5 rising democracies play in the international order. And I'm talking about, if I can get this going, 5 specific countries: India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and Turkey. And the question I'm asking myself is, as they become more important players in the international scene, will this help or set back our long struggle for human rights and democracy in the world? And my proposition is the answer depends on the role that these 5 countries in particular, and there are others, of course, that will play an important role, and I would include Argentina and Mexico and South Korea, But I focus on these 5 countries as both examples of transition of democracy and supporters of liberal ideas, but also potential promoters of these ideas. So why did I choose these 5 countries? All 5 of these countries have made important leaps from what were closed economies and illiberal governance to something more open and accountable. These are all countries that are works in progress. Democracy is not a final end state, it's a process. There's no such thing as a perfect democracy, including the United States. Let me make that very clear up front. These countries are facing major challenges. But if you compare their status to years before their transitions toward more liberal systems, you see a direct contrast. And I'm going to go over that in some detail. These are all very diverse societies with multiple languages, ethnicities, castes, religions, that really demonstrate the universal value of democracy and human rights. They've all, in response to the demand for change that's coming through electoral systems, accountable systems, governments are adjusting their policies and providing much greater forms of welfare. They've all made this kind of progress within a democratic context, so very much an antidote to the example of China, which also has made tremendous progress in terms of socioeconomic change, but doing it within a closed authoritarian system. And all 5 of these states would like a greater voice in the international order, but when it comes to their participation, their leadership on issues of democracy and human rights, they have a very mixed and weak record. Going the wrong way. So just a word about methodology. We started this process over 4 years ago. We commissioned research from experts in all 5 of these countries. I then did field research in all 5 countries, talking to a group of diplomats, businessmen, civil society, journalists, etc. I collected a tremendous amount of data, which you'll see on the future slides, comparing these countries to their experience before and after their turning points, their transitions to more liberal systems. Then I go deeply into their foreign policy history and give a sense of how it has changed. And then I've tried to come up with policy recommendations for where there might be convergence between the established traditional democracies and these newer rising democracies from the South. When we look at this question, we look at it in terms of democracy and development. And if you compare their, as I said, periods before and after their transition milestones, you'll see that they've made substantial progress, both in terms of economic development, human development, and political liberalization within this broader context of globalization and the third wave. Now, if you just look at issues of governance and rights, you see major improvements, which is not surprising. They were all moving toward democratic systems. Major improvements in terms of civil and political rights, civilian control of the military, which of course Argentina has a very important experience on that front, greater contributions to peacekeeping operations, a reduced role for the state in the economy, which has a mixed view, depending on your political point of view, but it does allow for greater freedom in the economy for individuals to create businesses. If you look more recently, there is stagnation and backsliding. So there's this initial increase and improvement, and then a flattening out and even a decline, particularly in a country like Turkey. So they are not the best performers, but they're not the worst performers either. They're somewhere in the middle. This slide just shows you in the Freedom House scores how they've changed. The lower the score, the better in terms of Freedom House scores. So Indonesia has made dramatic change. South Africa, of course, moving from apartheid to democracy. And on average, their score has gone from 3.4 to 2.6, which is in the right direction. But this shows, this is the World Bank collects a variety of information on what they call voice and accountability. and they look at different dimensions of governance, including corruption and rule of law. And you'll see the initial, particularly at the bottom two graphs, improvement for Indonesia and Turkey, and then a straight line or flattening out or decline. Now, if you turn to economic growth, you get a similar improvement, even more dramatic. Remarkable progress on GDP per capita in all 5 countries. The volatility of economic growth stabilizes. So democracy, it suggests that democracy helps support stability in economic growth. Dramatic declines in inflation, which of course puts more money in people's pockets. But in all cases, unemployment has increased and inequality has increased as well. Some declines, but overall that's the story. And how have governments responded? Democratic governments are more responsive to their citizens, to the voters, and they've expanded social benefits across the board. This is, I can go quickly over the graphs. This one shows the period before and after transition. Brazil has had the most dramatic increase in terms of GDP per capita, but Turkey and South Africa also greatly improved. This shows the stability of growth, and the big swings show instability, and the smaller swings show less. This one as well, average instability, the lower the number, the better. And then this shows the decrease in inflation. Brazil is not shown in this chart, I should note, because their period of hyperinflation was dramatic enough that it skewed the analysis. And then inequality, you'll see, has gone down a little bit in Brazil. South Africa has the worst level of inequality. The others are lower, but not really changing much. Now, let's look about not just economic development, but human development, because democracy generally cares about how its citizens are doing, and as a result of this liberalization reforms that these countries took, you see major improvements in human development across the board. Big drops in poverty, life expectancy improves, infant mortality declines, literacy rates improve, and there are more students in school, staying in school longer, including for women and girls. This is a collection of data that the UN puts together every year called the Human Development Index, and they've been collecting it since 1980. And this shows the progression over time, both before and after their transitions. And you see the improvement continues during their democratization periods. So particularly Brazil and Turkey, but all of these states have made important improvements on a range of social indicators. And just to highlight a couple of examples, infant mortality has dramatically declined across the board with the exception of South Africa. And the next chart shows you why. You'll see life expectancy increasing over time, but look at that blue line with the arrow pointing. That's South Africa. And the breakout is the prevalence of HIV/AIDS, which really skyrocketed in South Africa. Really a failure of policy, failure of the government to respond to the crisis, and as a result, they had very bad performance on infant mortality and maternal mortality as well. They've been spending a lot more money, the health expenditures are going up, and that problem seems to be leveling off. Brazil, on the right-hand side screens, took a very different approach, addressed it head-on, and have a much lower incidence of HIV as a result. Now, all this is happening within the context of globalization. And during this time, all 5 of these countries embraced globalization, expanded international trade and exports, welcomed foreign direct investment, and you see a major change in the trading pattern. So instead of all the goods going from south to north, they're increasingly going south-south. And of course that includes China being a major driver of the change, but not just China. When it comes to these countries then, as they've become richer, becoming donors instead of recipients of development assistance, it's a mixed picture. Turkey, to my surprise, is one of the top donors, particularly on humanitarian assistance. And that was before the crisis with Syria and the number of refugees that they're hosting. Brazil and India still both give and receive development assistance, and Indonesia is still receiving it. Of course, you all know the story of internet access, mobile phones. Remittances are very important for all these countries, particularly India. So these countries have more and more of a stake in what's happening in other parts of the world because their citizens are sending lots of money back home and contributing to their economy. And there's just a much greater increase of travel and study abroad, both ways. So more foreigners coming to visit their countries and the other way around. So this process of globalization, I argue, is a really important part of the story. These are a couple slides that show foreign direct investment and the big increase in particular in Brazil, which is the top line in red. And this specifically looks at Chinese foreign direct investment in these 5 countries. Huge increase in South Africa, you'll notice, and that has had a direct impact on South Africa's foreign policy, and I can get into that in more detail if you'd like. So, in a nutshell, all this data tells us that the liberalization process, both politically and economically, have really brought about significant improvements both in economic, political, and human development terms. These 5 countries perform above the global average in GDP growth rates and in progress toward the Millennium Development Goals. And so they've earned a certain amount of soft power in the world, I would argue, that these have become examples of both democratic and economic liberalization that have benefited the average citizens. So it posed the question, well, what are they going to do with this soft power? And now I want to turn to what I call the international liberal order, and I have a chapter in the book that just really goes into the elements of what that is. The book will be out, by the way, in end of January, early February, so this is kind of an early preview of what is coming out of it. But clearly, all of these states have benefited from the process of globalization and the international liberal order. Of course, their adoption of democratic systems for their own societies, they've chosen this path, and they like to, they're proud of it, and they use that to attract more international investment, but also a greater claim for power on the world stage. But they're not really on board with the idea of promoting democracy and human rights in other countries, even though it's been of great. These are swing states where concepts of sovereignty, traditional concepts of sovereignty, and what is in the national interest really override an interest in what I call democratic peace theory, which argues that our own national interests are better protected by supporting democracy in other countries, because democracies traditionally do not go to war with one another, do not spawn famines or refugees. I mean, if you look around the world, what's happening right now in the Middle East, I don't think it's coincidence that these states are having so much trouble reconciling among themselves because they've not found a language or a mechanism to reach some kind of peaceful reconciliation. Democracies have a much better track record of doing that. Now, if you look at where they come from, these are countries with long histories of colonialism, apartheid, military dictatorships, and they were supported by the West. And that memory doesn't fade away overnight. So you have that history behind you. On top of that, the way democracy promotion has been practiced has been very controversial, particularly during the 2000s when the United States invaded Iraq under the guise of democracy at the point of a gun. And it has really polarized the whole, and poisoned, I would say, the whole business of democracy promotion. And I would say the same for the concept of responsibility to protect, which is a concept that was endorsed by all member states of the United Nations back in 2000 and 2005, and was actually employed in the case of Libya. The UN Security Council authorized use of force to protect civilians, which was unheard of, really a breakthrough in terms of putting human beings first instead of national security. But that's not the way it played out. The way it played out was, we're going in there to get rid of Gaddafi and regime change. And the states that voted for it, including India and Brazil and South Africa, really regret it, because they see the responsibility to protect doctrine as a way to the West imposing its own wishes on other countries. And look, on top of that, look what's happened in Libya since then. I mean, there was no serious plan to address the chaos that ensued. And including the United States kind of stepped back and said, okay, now you guys fix that problem, you yourselves. And it's become a hotbed of terrorism and chaos. So in the end, I think these 5 states are very cautious about how do you promote democracy and human rights. They're realists, but they're liberal realists, because they do believe in supporting democratic change in other countries. They accept the basic core elements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the human rights treaties, both at the regional and the international level. But they don't agree with the means that the West has used to defend those rights. And at the end of the day, strategic autonomy is really most important to them. Of course, each of these countries have very important roles to play in their own region. And they, nonetheless, are not true hegemons, I would say, none of these 5. They are certainly not accepted as hegemons by their neighbors, hegemons. Brazil is competing with lots of other states, including the United States, for leadership in the Americas. South Africa, during the apartheid era, imposed its will on many of its neighbors, and there's still this ghost of the apartheid era. They don't want to be pushing too hard on their neighbors. India has been relatively passive in asserting itself in South Asia, although that's beginning to change under Modi. The Indonesians have a very soft touch. They very much see themselves as leaders of Southeast Asia and as leaders of the regional organization known as ASEAN. But they do it in a very soft way. And then, of course, you have the development of BRICS and IMSA. And for some of these states, India, Brazil, and South Africa, they've really lately chosen the BRICS as their primary card in the international political game. And IMSA has declined in prominence. You know, IMSA is a collective of these 3 democratic states that portrayed themselves as democracies and caring about political values. But in practice, they really have not operationalized much, and BRICS have gone way ahead, and you can see with the role of Russia and China the way that's playing out in their foreign policy. A quick side note, my general observation is that there's a process of democratization of foreign policy going on in all of these countries. There is more room, more space for media, for labor unions, for businesses, for NGOs to monitor, criticize, and influence foreign policy. Parliaments, of course, either directly or through parliaments, playing an important role. And what I have here and in the book are a number of examples. We don't have to go into all of them, but they're interesting examples where coalitions of civil society groups have engaged to influence their country's foreign policy in these countries on human rights issues. And you can use examples in each of these 5 countries to support that. Okay. Since we're in South America, I just wanted to spend a minute on Brazil. Brazil is really one of the clearest cases of the doctrine of strategic autonomy, where they have, particularly under President Lula, made a very ambitious grab for regional and global leadership. But at the end of the day, you know, they fall back to principles of sovereignty, non-coercive means over their own constitution, which calls for human rights being a paramount concern in their foreign policy. Now, there are a very important period in the 80s and 90s where Brazil in particular led the effort to create what I call democracy clauses, which are prominent in this region, which is like an insurance policy against military coups d'etat. And that has played a really important role in consolidating democracy in the region. But as those forms of executive grabs for power have changed, so not just military coups, but other ways of using elections and the judiciary and kind of pulling power toward the executive, as those have grown, the inter-American system and the others have not really responded to those cases successfully. Of course, all of these countries are facing massive demands for economic development, and that becomes a priority over a concern for human rights, particularly when they're in conflict. Brazil, I think, is going through a really important moment right now. I think it will already, we're seeing an effect on their ambitions in foreign policy terms. But I also see in the medium to long term some very positive signs in terms of how their democracy is responding to the crisis. And you see the importance of checks and balances, of a more independent judiciary and prosecutors, and a very active civil society and media that are pushing the system toward accountability for these massive accusations of corruption. So there's a silver lining, I think, to the Brazil story, and of course we'll see what happens in the coming year or two, how that evolves. So that slide was a little misplaced, but these, going back to the civil society, these are just other examples, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer. Another example from Brazil, an NGO that has really been a lead voice in pressuring their foreign ministry to change their positions on human rights at the United Nations, on countries like Iran and North Korea. They train a lot of activists from throughout the global south. So a couple of final thoughts. I think that there are many opportunities for win-win outcomes between North and South on these issues. But it starts probably, in my view, with the traditional democracies getting their house in order and practicing what they preach. I mean, the United States in particular has been the loudest voice pushing other countries to move toward democracy and human rights, and yet it faces huge gaps in its own practice on these issues. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail. But as an American, seeing what's happening in my country is a great concern. And that is a very common notion. The reason you're seeing outsider candidates like Donald Trump doing so well is because people are sick and tired of how the system is working and feel that money in particular has really corrupted the way business is done. So we need to fix our own house. It doesn't mean you stop supporting democracy and human rights in other countries, but it does mean you have to do a much better job of practicing what you preach and understanding where these 5 countries in particular are coming from, given their own history and given the history of the West, and supporting periods of dictatorship and apartheid. One question is whether there's a grand bargain here. As these states like Brazil want a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, there could be a better understanding of them buying into the international liberal order than we currently see in practice. The question is, how do you get there? But I think that is a question that's on the table. You also, I think, see a proliferation of regional institutions and mechanisms, some of them quite positive, but not always aligned with the international norms. And so there's a danger that as the world splits into regional blocs, that you can have an undermining of the universal principles that have been constructed over the last 50 years. So one way to deal with this is more work to be done to build cross-regional coalitions of democracies, and this is already happening at the UN Human Rights Council through organizations like International IDEA in Sweden and through the Community of Democracies that are trying to build these kinds of cross-regional networks. Here, based on the consultations I've done, I throw out some specific ideas where there might be win-win solutions. These are concerns that cut across all democracies, civil society is very much under attack, and not just in Russia. It's happening in India, it's happening in Ukraine, in many other countries. This is a major concern. You need civil society, whether you're working on women's rights or economic and social rights, housing rights, or political rights, internet rights. You need to have the ability to operate and have freedom of association, and that's a major concern. With the proliferation of the internet, you need to have freedom of the internet and the ability for citizens to access information. I think corruption is one of the big signature issues that all societies are facing, and much more work can be done in that area. When you talk about human rights in the global south, what you're first going to hear are basic rights of food, water, shelter, health. And in the north, particularly in the United States, we don't really talk about those as rights. These are benefits that are provided by government, but they're not seen as rights that you can litigate in court for. Well, I think we need to get over that. These are rights under international law, and there are many ways in which they can be addressed. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration on those issues. Many, many studies show that the more you educate women and girls, the more benefits you will have across society in multiple domains. It's a no-brainer. And so we need to make a massive leap in our support for education for girls and women. And then finally, with the rise of the private sector and businesses, transnational companies around the world, you need to bring them into the system and hold them accountable to a set of international norms on that front. Last slide. I think these states, I'm more optimistic, I think these states have the potential to become more active supporters of liberal norms, but they want to do it on their own terms. Some countries, particularly some elites, are really, their primary focus is on counterbalancing the United States. That comes first, and the West, and that I think has proven to be an obstacle to finding this common ground on democracy and human rights. And a much greater preference for the flexibility that comes with strategic autonomy, where you have multiple partnerships with multiple countries and fewer alliances that are really meaningful. I think the United States needs to revisit the costs and benefits of their choice of tools for promoting democracy and human rights. I think President Obama understands that to a degree, but I'm not so sure if the Republicans win in 2016, what we're going to get. The role of civil society and other voices in democratizing foreign policy will continue, so there'll be more and more pressure from below and from other institutions, but I think that cuts both ways. You'll have interest groups that want their country to do X that's not going to be a pro-human rights kind of position, versus a more cosmopolitan civil society that sees the value of having an international system of norms that and mechanisms that can then work to put pressure on their own domestic situations. Finally, you might all know about the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in September at the UN General Assembly. These provide a great opportunity to connect the development goals with democracy and human rights. And there's a very important goal in there that supports access to justice, rule of law, accountable institutions, that really puts the resources behind the development assistance connected to good governance, good democratic governance, as the way forward. That's it. I look forward to your questions.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Ted. Tengo una pregunta allá atrás, otra acá. Acá, por favor, de la torre.
I want to thank Professor Piccone for the presentation, very interesting. Certainly, the subject of your book, The Five Rising Democracies, is something that we all have in mind, not just the fact, but democracy itself. But this process, as you know, Samuel Huntington had made a lot of work late. Sam Huntington did a lot of work.
There's a problem with noise, sorry.
It's hard to hear.
No funciona.
No.
Háblale bien directo al
Is it
micrófono.
working?
Háblale bien.
Hola.
Bueno, de frente.
Sí, de frente, de punta.
Hola.
Ahí está.
But let's say that to put this your presentation in a context, and then my question comes from that context. The U.S. after the Second World War, in a certain way with Europe and Japan emerged as what is called the West in a certain way. And those were the core liberal values that were in a certain way the ones that are the norms today. Now, something impressed me when I saw a map there between red and blue. It's interesting that most of the whole, let's say, Latin America was, exception of Chile, was red, and blue was only Chile. That's something comes from my question, which means now this, besides this notion of the West that came after the Second World War, the United States for more than 100 years made an enormous contribution. I would say that we all made that contribution to the Pan-American system, which in your background you know this very well. But the Pan-American system was part and is part of the values of democracies and contributed extremely important advances in that sense, even to Europe, which wasn't at the time really very democratic at the beginning of the 20th century. So honestly, how do you see that this hemisphere, which we constructed for more or less 200 years together, gets into this analysis, which comes, from former, some of them empires like India or Brazil, or Russia certainly, which China for sure, which are very different in our tradition. I understand that we all want the world to have this value, but the context and how do you see the relationship towards the future?
A ver, vamos a tomar dos o tres preguntas. Las preguntas pueden hacerse perfectamente en español porque Piccone entiende perfectamente y lo habla,
perfectamente.
pero por de tímido nomás habló en inglés. Acá el embajador Lufreni.
Sí, que será mejor.
En español. Y corto.
¿Se oye bien?
Sí. No, más o menos. Me parece, el problema no era tuyo, sino del micrófono.
Así ahora se oye mejor.
Sí.
Just thank you first in English in your language for the analysis I gave in such language. I appreciate very much your analysis. And I think that in the library of your analysis there are two bookshelves or categories that seems to be missing. Now it's Spanish.
Closer.
Creo que en el interesante análisis que usted ha proporcionado hay dos categorías de situaciones que estarían faltando.
Repetirlo porque no se entendió.
I don't know about
Just get up and elaborate.
Y parate y hablamos fuerte.
You want me to go near you? I can come near you. Maybe it's
Ahí te habla más ahí.
En la categoría en los análisis suyos hay dos categorías que estarían faltando, me da impresión. La primera tiene que ver con países en los cuales hay partidos o corrientes políticas internas que están alejadas de los principios y valores de la democracia liberal. Me refiero a aquellos países que siguen las ideas de Gramsci, en los cuales el diálogo no les interesa, la reconciliación no les interesa, están más deseosos de crear temor y dominar por el miedo que por la armonía y la búsqueda del bien común. Eso no fue manejado por usted, y creo que eso es un problema que está existiendo, al menos en algunos países de América del Sur, y que merecen un análisis bastante detallado porque puede ser muy importante en el futuro, si es que no lo es ya. El segundo tiene que ver con una situación que se refleja en los problemas de las migraciones que está sufriendo Europa. Ahí me animo a decir que el régimen de democracia liberal está sufriendo una amenaza muy seria, porque sabemos, por lo menos cuando recibimos DVDs y análisis de Europa, que en algunos países ya el fundamentalismo islámico está señalando que en los próximos 10 años es muy posible que tomen control de importantes capitales a través de los regímenes ¿cómo se llama? De cabildos, no cabildos, pero de consejos legislativos y gobiernos locales, de ciudades. Un paso a llegar al gobierno nacional. Y ahí me trae al problema de que lo que parece que se está necesitando es un reajuste de la visión del mundo de parte de los países que están en una situación de liderazgo. Cuando cayó el muro de Berlín, recuerdo, se decía, vamos a ver cómo se podrá orientar el dinero, los recursos que ya no son necesarios para el armamento bélico, para ayudar al desarrollo de los países en desarrollo. Sí. Pero no sucedió así. Se decía que había que mejorar las condiciones de vida en los países de desarrollo para que precisamente hubiese más interés en quedarse en sus propios países por oportunidades de trabajo que se creaban. Vemos que esto fracasó. Creo que esas son dos categorías de análisis importantes, con la consecuencia que la democracia liberal está siendo peligrosamente amenazada seriamente en Europa. Gracias.
Okay. Sí, son dos preguntas importantes. Well, on the map, it's not my favorite map, and it will change in the future because it doesn't fully represent what I'm trying to get across. It's really meant to be a basic map showing north and south geographically, but it has Chile in blue, which isn't right. It should be in red. So that was the point of the map. But I think more interestingly, your question about the Inter-American system's contribution to the rest of the world, I agree with that fundamental point. I mean, it's the oldest regional system. It took a long time for the practice of its states to reach the level of principles that were being promoted and that states had committed to. And it really was not until the 1980s and 1990s that you could say that this was a region of democratizing states on the path to democracy. Now, there are many states connected to your question, including in this region, that we would call illiberal democracies that are not living up to the principles and have made it very difficult to actually have civil political discourse. Venezuela being a very obvious example, particularly right now. So that would be a whole other book to add them into the equation. The reason I picked these countries was because I thought their process of democratization had reached a point of consolidation where progress would continue. Now, no transition to democracy is linear. It's steps forward and backwards. And so at a moment in time, it looks like it's going backwards, but in fact it's a bump that will then allow it to go forward. And you can see that in many, many cases of democratic transition around the world. Turkey, it's not clear to me, actually, right now. As long as they have Erdogan in power, I think you're going to see backsliding. President Erdogan has chosen a more authoritarian path, working within the democratic system. So this year, we saw 2 elections in Turkey. And the first one very clearly was a rejection of his vision for the country in terms of political control. And what happened after that? He prevented a coalition government from forming. He really turned up the language, and not only the language, but the actual actions against the Kurdish minority, and increased the threats and the fears that drove enough voters to feel, safer with his party than with the alternatives. So we have Erdogan back in control, but not at the same level of power that he would need to actually rewrite the constitution. So the electoral process in Turkey has proven to be a check on his power. Now, he has done a pretty good job at controlling other parts of society to reduce influence on him, including the media, very aggressively against the media, and the courts are under a lot of pressure. So I think it's a very risky moment for Turkey right now. Now, on the point about migration, I'm still an optimist that democratic societies are more resilient and able to absorb different populations. I mean, our own countries, Argentina and the United States, have experienced that in our national history. And because we have rules of the game that allow for negotiation and compromise, we have freedom of religion, people can exercise their religion. These are key ingredients for what we call resiliency, for some form of stability. I think Europe is pretty far advanced in those values. The question is whether the attacks of this past week in Paris will radicalize the population to demand a stop to the migration, greater repressive measures, and a pullback from democracy and human rights. I think that's the main concern. I'm confident that Europe will not throw away the baby with the bathwater in the name of security, but I think there will be a period where the national xenophobic forces of the far right in particular will continue to grow in importance in these countries. And whether it will become a majority, I doubt, but it will have a greater voice in the future.
Ricardo.
Muchas gracias. Creo que su intervención ha sido sumamente interesante, pero quisiera responder esta pregunta. Entre las rising democracies, que usted toma un periodo que es la década del 80 y del 90, ¿por qué no está incluida la Argentina? Porque la Argentina realmente no solamente restableció la democracia en la década del 80, como así también la vigencia de los derechos humanos, sino que dio un gran apoyo al proceso de democratización de América Latina. Más aún diría, llegó esta actividad al campo de las Naciones Unidas. La Argentina tuvo una intervención de liderazgo en lo que se respecta al restablecimiento de la democracia en Haití. Más aún, nosotros participamos en la operación de mantenimiento de la paz. Fue el primer país latinoamericano que envió un contingente en un momento que estaba dirigido a normalizar Haití desde el punto de vista institucional y democrático. Y por último, también en el campo internacional, yo creo que hay ciertos valores vinculados con derechos humanos y ciertos principios fundamentales contenidos en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, como por ejemplo la intervención que la Argentina tuvo en Irak. En la primera intervención fue muy importante porque incuestionablemente, a diferencia de la segunda intervención en Irak en el año 2003 de Estados Unidos, en el año en la comisión, en el año 90, a comienzos de los 90, la intervención de la comunidad internacional y sobre todo de algunos países, entre los cuales estaba la Argentina y Estados Unidos, su intervención fue plenamente legitimada por la acción y la decisión del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas. Gracias.
Tengo dos preguntas más, una acá y después tomamos las tres y después contestás. Acá, tercera fila.
Muchas gracias. No sé, ¿me escuchan?
Sí.
¿Me puedo parar?
Mejor, sí.
Con el beneficio del doctor Piccone, Me debo presentar, soy el embajador de El Salvador y he venido un poco a agradecerle lo que usted ha hecho y ha trabajado en mi país. ¿Sí? Me llamó la atención una relación que usted establece entre las reformas liberalizadoras, ¿sí?, y logros sociales, de reducción de la pobreza, reducción de la mortalidad infantil, etc. Al mismo tiempo, usted introduce una variable que estos países, específicamente cuando hay una reducción en el empleo y por tanto en los ingresos, establecen una serie de políticas sociales. El éxito en esos indicadores no sería más bien resultados de las políticas sociales y no tanto directamente de las transformaciones liberalizadoras. Les pregunto porque tenemos situaciones en el continente que no son muy liberales, pero hacen muchas políticas sociales, y otros que no hacen muchas políticas sociales, pero son bastante liberales. Entonces sí es interesante ver cuál es la conexión y con qué es la conexión directa de los logros en el área social. Gracias.
Allá el embajador. Vamos a dejar para después esto. Tomamos una más, conteste y después.
Muchas gracias a Ted por la presentación.
No, sí, pero habla más alto la voz.
Muchas gracias Ted por la presentación. Hace por lo menos media hora que está en pantalla el título, y yo quiero referirme a esa ecuación que hay en el título entre, por un lado, 5 democracias emergentes y el destino del orden liberal internacional. Me parece que es una interesante ecuación, porque uno se olvida que cuando se crea este orden liberal había solamente 51 estados, hoy hay 193 en Naciones Unidas, y muchas de esas democracias no existían. Entonces me parece muy interesante a futuro, y creo que está planteando una pregunta más que una afirmación: ¿cómo podemos conseguir un orden por primera vez global, estable, que tiene un fundamento liberal y del cual no fueron partícipes muchos países que hoy son actores? Entonces, simplemente resaltar este desafío que tenemos si queremos construir un orden global, para que todos los países que no fueron artífices de la creación, empezando por China, porque hasta el 72, no nos olvidemos que en Naciones Unidas estaba Taiwán, los chinos, pequeño detalle. Hasta el 1972 el país que se sentaba en el Consejo de Seguridad no era la República Popular de China, sino Taiwán. Me parece que ese desafío es muy interesante y fundamental para elaborar un orden global estable que, como bien dice Kissinger, sería la primera vez que lo tuviéramos. Más allá de que me encantaría que estuviera Argentina entre esas 5 democracias, pero me parecería que en el planteo tuyo, teórico y académico, lo más importante es resolver la ecuación y después llenar quizás la primera parte. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you. Those are great questions. So why not Argentina, which I think also relates to, Ricardo, your question. It could have been Argentina. I was looking for one state in each region of the world that would demonstrate this dilemma between big states. You know, Brazil, if you compare to Brazil and Argentina, it's a much bigger place. And it has set forth, I think, a set of aspirations that are global and not just regional. It doesn't mean Argentina hasn't, but I think it's been much more evident in the part of Brazil over the last, particularly the last decade. The size of its economy, the size of its population, the size of the country, its relations with Africa as well as China. I thought it was, if I were to pick one from each region. Now Mexico would be another example in addition to Argentina. I've watched closely Argentina's, for example, voting record at the United Nations. And Argentina has been a very consistent supporter of human rights at the United Nations, particularly in Geneva and New York. So I think it's clear that Argentina has put a priority on this value because of its own experience. And what's striking to me is that these other countries have not done what Argentina has done. In a way, Argentina's already there. Mexico, in a large way, is already there. They've already accepted. I mean, Mexico has completely changed its foreign policy position in the world. Much more engaged in the international order, much more supportive of liberal norms. Brazil is not. Brazil is moving back and forth all the time. So I wanted to get into those harder cases. So that's why Argentina. Now, the very good question about cause and effect. I'm not an economist, so I'll be honest about that. I don't think you can prove scientifically the cause and effect of the liberalization reforms and the results that you got in terms of human development. But I think it has created a certain environment and a context for those changes to happen. And in part because you have a political system that's more responsive to what the voters want, which is jobs and other kinds of education, good schools that are, a lot of displacement and dislocation from the liberal economic order that have to be addressed. That's why you have democratic responsive governments to cope with that kind of problem. There should be a role for the state in the economy and in social policy, without a doubt. And there's been enormous improvement in those countries that have chosen programs like Bolsa Familia and other places. Conditional cash transfers have really played a very important role in the improvement of the standards. But the other point I was trying to draw out in comparison to a place like China or other non-democracies is that democracy can play both an instrumental value, but also has its own intrinsic value. I mean, if you value freedom, then democracies, and freedom costs, actually. Freedom is not free. It's a phrase my dad used often. But you can show in GDP terms that there is an extra cost associated with having a democracy in terms of GDP in the day. It's more expensive to have a democracy. There's more involved in the process of negotiation and reconciliation. It's quite logical when you think about it. So I think we have to think about the values of democracy in both terms, as instrumental and intrinsic values. In terms of, Ricardo, the role of other countries in the international order, there are a number of small states that play a really important role. And they play that role in part because of their own history, and I'm talking about both South and North. And they often are the glue that will bring together an initiative on human rights. The Baltic states, where we last saw each other, it would be one example. Some of the African states at the United Nations have really, states like Ghana and Sierra Leone and Botswana have played important roles in this regard. So obviously these 5 countries are not going to be the sole determining factor, but I think because they're so big, economically, politically, they have these ambitions. They are swing states. So where are they going to swing? And I think that matters. Particularly if you saw all 5 swing either highly neutral or in favor of Russia and China, that would really weaken the international liberal order. I think that's the point I'm trying to get at.
Thanks a lot for the brilliant presentation. And my question was just a run-up of the one with Mr. Ambassador already posed to you. And it was very clear to me all the positive aspects that this blooming democracy have. And the point is that it caught my attention that one of the slides showed the negative aspects of the unemployment and equality. And I don't know if in the book it's like better described and explained, but I was wondering if finally these 2
part again? Or risks.
Yes, a risk. Because, of course, I mean, the positive aspects are very clear, but if people do not have jobs or they don't have money, finally.
¿Otra pregunta?
Okay. I think unemployment and inequality are risks for democracies because it tells us if they continue to persist or get worse that governments are not responding to their voters. That is how governments are held accountable. And you see this as currently a big problem in the United States where inequality has dramatically increased over the last several years. So this is a problem with our economic model mostly, but it's also a problem with our political system because our political system has made it easier and easier, including because of the way our Supreme Court interprets our freedom of expression, has given corporations the right to donate at levels that we've never seen before as a way for them to express their views in the system. And the money is increasingly not transparent. And it's going to organizations that support campaigns in ways that the voters don't even know who is supporting these campaigns. To me, this is how political and economic excesses of a free system get out of control and undermine the core values of democracy. So my question is for the United States, are we going to react to that in course correct? You know, democracies tend to have self-correcting mechanisms that when things get too far one way or the other, come back to the middle. And instead of collapsing, they self-correct. And that's a question for a lot of these cases where inequality has grown so high. And this is why Bernie Sanders is such an interesting candidate right now in the United States, because he's raising these questions in very direct terms and saying we've got to change our economic system to allow for more equality in the system. And that runs counter to a lot of our political culture. But he's getting a lot of support with this argument. So I think the more open your system is, the more these ideas can impact and move policy toward the middle in positive ways. You know, the volatility I showed before of the big ups and downs of non-democracies, you know, Indonesia is a very good example of that. Under Suharto, or in Brazil under the military dictatorship, some periods of high growth, but then massive periods of collapse and hyperinflation and lack of control. So democracy tended to be more stable in that sense. And there needs to be some course correction along the way, without a doubt. But it requires voters to register, to vote, to give to their candidates, to get engaged. If they don't, then you're going to get what we have in the United States.
Could you please repeat the name of the candidate in the United States?
Bernie Sanders. He's a socialist from Vermont, which is unheard of in our system. Like, we don't have socialists. I mean, it's really unheard of. And he's really a social democrat, but he calls himself a socialist. And he is promoting a very, you know, leftist-oriented, but in this Scandinavian model of change. And people are listening to him, and we'll see what kind of impact it has. But it's an example of how the terms of the debate are changing.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, le agradecemos a Ted Piccone por su exposición, su buena voluntad.
Gracias.